Far away, hidden in the quiet folds of an unnamed valley, there once stood an ancient monastery. No one remembered when it was built. The stones were older than memory, and the walls carried the scent of cold wax and smoke. People in the nearby village called it the House of the Quiet Flame. For centuries, the monastery had one simple duty: to keep a single flame alive. They said that this flame was lit when the world was still young, before the first church bell ever rang, before kings had names. The monks called themselves the Candle Keepers. Their lives were bound to silence. From dawn till dusk, they moved like shadows through stone corridors, carrying candles shaped by their own hands. Every candle was made from beeswax gathered from the hives hidden behind the monastery. The monks believed that if the flame ever died, time itself would forget their valley, that the world would simply move on, leaving the monastery behind as if it had never existed. Inside the main hall stood hundreds of candles arranged in perfect lines. The air there was warm, heavy with the scent of melted wax. The light never flickered harshly. It moved gently, breathing against the walls like a sleeping soul. Every step echoed softly, and even a whisper felt like a disturbance to centuries of quiet. The candle keepers had rules ancient, written on parchment that had turned yellow and fragile. No outsider could enter the monastery after sunset. No candle could be lit with anything other than the eternal flame that burned in the central chamber. And no word could be spoken while carrying the light through the corridor known as the Passage of Breath. Each rule was obeyed without question. The monks never asked where the flame came from or who had first lit it. They only knew the ritual: melt the wax, pour it into carved molds, wait, then carry the newborn candle to the hall, light it, and leave it among hundreds of others. At night, the valley outside turned to mist. The villagers below could see the faint golden glow rising from the monastery windows, like hundreds of quiet souls standing guard. Some said that when the wind blew from the north, you could hear faint chanting, not words, but hums, vibrations, a kind of breathing song. Generations came and went. The world beyond changed. Kingdoms fell, cities rose, but the candle keepers stayed the same. They lived without time. They kept their hands steady and their breaths slow. In the oldest part of the monastery, there was a stone tablet with half-erased letters. It was said to describe the first day the flame was born, but no one could read it anymore. The script was unknown, the words foreign, the meaning lost. And so, the monks simply called it the beginning. Every morning, one monk, chosen by silence, not by name, would walk barefoot into the chamber of the eternal flame. He would kneel, close his eyes, and listen. They believed the flame spoke, not in words, but in warmth. When he returned, he would light the candles for the day, and the monastery would awaken, not with bells or voices, but with the sound of breathing and the smell of light. No one outside ever saw their faces. Some said the candle keepers lived for hundreds of years, their skin pale from the glow of wax and fire. Others said that new monks quietly replaced the old ones without anyone knowing, that no death was ever witnessed, only the endless continuation of duty. Over time, travelers who passed through the valley began to tell stories, that sometimes, during foggy nights, they saw figures holding candles walking along the hills, moving in perfect lines, though the monastery gates were said to have been locked for generations. The villagers stopped going near the valley after sunset. The light had become too strange, too still. And so the candle keepers were left entirely alone. Inside, they continued their work. Candles melted, candles were made again. Wax turned to flame, and flame to wax. It was the same pattern, the same rhythm, quiet, ancient, endless. And yet, somewhere deep inside the monastery, below the main hall, there was a sealed door. It had no lock, only a mark burned into the stone, the symbol of a candle turned upside down. None of the monks ever spoke of it. It was said that behind that door, the flame had once gone out, just for a moment. The candle keepers believed that if it ever happened again, the world would forget them entirely, as if their light had never been. There was a place inside the monastery that few ever entered. It lay beyond the central hall, through a narrow archway carved with faded symbols, spirals, circles, and the mark of dripping wax. The monks called it the Chamber of Wax. It was not a place of prayer, nor silence, but of making, where the old became new, and melted shapes were given form again. The air there was heavy with warmth. The walls were coated in thin layers of hardened wax, smooth like marble, and shining faintly under the candlelight. Every surface glowed softly, as if the room itself was made of solidified flame. The candle keepers would enter barefoot, their robes brushing the floor, carrying small pots of golden wax. They never spoke. They worked by rhythm, the same slow movement passed down through unbroken years. Hands dipped into warm wax, poured it into molds, and waited. Every mold was carved from stone, not wood. The oldest among them bore cracks and faint fingerprints, as though long-dead monks had left their marks centuries ago. The candles were made in sizes and shapes few could imagine: tall spirals, wide discs, thin ropes twisted together, some shaped like towers, others like bells. The monks never made candles for beauty. Each form held meaning, a symbol connected to time, breath, and silence. A spiral candle was for memory, burning slower than all others. A bell-shaped candle marked the hour when the valley fog began to fall. As the wax cooled, faint lines appeared across their surfaces, like veins or ancient writing. No one carved them. They simply emerged on their own. The candle keepers said it was the flame's language, that every candle held a message from the eternal fire, but none could read it. They simply accepted, as they always did. Inside the chamber of wax, time did not move in a straight line. The air was so thick with the scent of honey and smoke that days felt like hours, and hours like weeks. Sometimes a monk would enter and emerge only after the candles had melted halfway down, unsure of how long he had been there. On the far wall hung a large brass mirror. It was darkened with age, its surface spotted and blurred. Yet, when the candles burned around it, faint shapes flickered inside, not reflections of the monks, but of something else. Silhouettes that moved slower than human, as if trapped behind the glass. No one looked directly at it. It was said that the mirror showed the faces of those who had once kept the flame and failed. Every year, on the last day of winter, the monks gathered in silence within the chamber. They brought with them all the candles that had burned halfway, those that had never finished their purpose. These were melted together in a great basin in the center of the room. The mixture was thick, heavy, and smelled faintly of centuries. When stirred, it shimmered faintly, catching light in a strange way, like liquid memory. This wax, they said, was sacred. It carried the breath of every monk who had ever lit a candle. From it, they created what they called the Great Candle of Renewal. It was enormous, as tall as a man, and burned only once every 100 years. When lit, it was said to restore the monastery's life, sealing the cracks in its walls, quieting the ghosts of sound that sometimes drifted through the corridors at night. But lighting it was not simple. The flame for the great candle could only come from the eternal fire in the deepest chamber, the one few had ever seen. Only the oldest monk, known as the Silent Keeper, could approach that chamber. His face was never shown, even to his brothers. He lived apart in the lower vaults, speaking to no one. On the night of renewal, the Silent Keeper emerged. The sound of his steps echoed like soft drops of wax falling. He carried a thin rod made of bone, its tip blackened from centuries of use. With that rod, he would take a spark from the eternal flame and carry it up, inch by inch, never letting it go out. No one else could breathe during that time. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. The moment the great candle caught fire, the entire monastery filled with a golden glow, soft, deep, alive. It was said that the light touched even the sealed door beneath the monastery, the one marked with the upside-down candle. And for that one night, everything felt reborn. But in the days that followed, whispers always spread among the monks. Some said that, each century, the great candle burned a little shorter than before. Its flame was slightly dimmer, its wax cooled faster, the air in the monastery felt colder. Still, the monks did not speak of fear. They only worked, shaping more candles, melting more wax, repeating the same endless pattern. In the corner of the chamber, behind stacks of old molds, there was said to be a small alcove where the oldest wax was kept, wax that was never melted, never touched. It was pale, almost white, with streaks of gray running through it like ash. The monks believed it came from the first candle ever made. They never used it. They never spoke of it. They simply bowed their heads each time they passed it, as if greeting something older than their faith. Outside, the valley remained silent. The light from the monastery windows flickered against the fog, faint and distant, but unbroken. The villagers below had long stopped watching. For them, it was just a glow, something that had always been there, something that always would. But deep beneath the wax-scented air, in the silence between breaths, the flame of the eternal fire moved, not like light, but like thought, as if it remembered. Beyond the chamber of wax, past a corridor where even footsteps seemed to disappear, there stood a vast, empty space. It was not lit by candles, nor touched by sound. The candle keepers called it the Hall of Silence. It was said to be the oldest room in the monastery, built before the others, when the first monks were still learning how to speak the language of flame. The stones were uneven, carved by hand. No carvings, no symbols, only the weight of time pressed into every wall. Those who entered the hall did so barefoot, holding no light. They came only when their hearts grew too loud, when thoughts, dreams, or fears began to disturb the still rhythm of their work. For here, in this darkness, everything vanished. The hall had no windows. The air inside was colder than the rest of the monastery. If one stood still for long enough, they could hear the sound of their own blood moving through their veins. That was the only sound the hall allowed. The candle keepers believed that silence was not the absence of sound, but a living thing, an ancient presence that watched over the flame. To disturb was to weaken the light. So they visited the hall not to pray, but to forget, to empty themselves until they became as still as wax before the wick is lit. At the center of the hall was a circular mark on the floor, a shallow groove carved into the stone. It was always cold to the touch. No one knew who had made it or when. It was said that long ago, the first monk had drawn it there with the tip of a burned candle, marking the place where silence began. Each monk who entered would sit upon the edge of that circle, close their eyes, and breathe slowly. Sometimes they stayed for minutes, sometimes for days. When they finally rose, they spoke of nothing, but their eyes carried a new stillness, as if they had looked at something that could not be described. The Hall of Silence had another secret. Hidden behind the northern wall was a narrow slit, no wider than a candle flame. Through it, a faint breeze entered, not enough to move a wick, but just enough to keep the air alive. Some said it was the breath of the mountain itself. Others said it was the whisper of those who once guarded the eternal fire. When the great candle of renewal was lit once every century, the monks would gather in the hall afterward. They would sit together in rows, eyes closed, hands resting on their knees. No chant, no ceremony, only silence. The glow from the distant corridors would faintly reach them, washing the walls with gold. For that 1 hour, all the candles in the monastery burned perfectly. Not a single flicker, not a single shadow. It was as if the Hall of Silence absorbed every sound, every disturbance, and returned it to stillness. No one kept records of what happened there. The candle keepers did not write journals or histories. They believed memory was a form of noise, something that trapped the mind in time. Instead, they lived by rhythm and repetition. The flame was their memory. The wax was their history. The silence was their prayer. Outside, storms would pass through the valley, tearing branches from trees and shaking the roofs of the village below. But the monastery never moved. The sound of thunder could not reach the hall, the walls swallowed whole. Once, many winters ago, a traveler lost his way in the snow and stumbled to the monastery gates. He claimed that when he called out, his voice disappeared before it reached the doors, as if the very air had eaten it. The monks found him unconscious by dawn. When he woke, he could no longer speak. His lips moved, but no sound came. He lived for a year in the village below, silent and distant. When he finally died, the villagers placed a small candle on his grave. They said that on certain nights, when the wind blew from the north, that candle still flickered by itself, a faint glow that lasted until sunrise. The candle keepers never confirmed the story, but they never denied it either. To them, silence was sacred, and sacred things were never explained. Within the hall, the floor remained cold, the walls unchanged. The monks still came and went, dissolving their thoughts into the quiet air. Sometimes the silence seemed so deep that it felt alive, like it was listening, waiting for something. And in that stillness, beneath centuries of breathing stone, the faint pulse of the eternal flame could be felt, slow, steady, older than time itself. It was said that the Hall of Silence was not only where the monks came to forget their thoughts, but where the flame itself came to rest when it grew weary of burning. Beneath the monastery, under layers of stone and dust, lay the lower vaults, a labyrinth of narrow halls that most of the candle keepers never saw. It was said that the walls themselves were older than the monastery above them. No one knew who had carved them, or why. The entrance to the vaults was hidden behind a slab of stone at the far end of the Hall of Silence. It bore no handle, no hinge, only a small hole in its center, perfectly round and smooth, as if made by the steady dripping of wax. When the time came, one monk, chosen in silence, would press the stem of an unlit candle into the hole. The stone would tremble faintly and shift, opening into the darkness below. Only one monk could descend each generation. The others would stand still in the hall above, holding their candles, waiting. No one spoke, no one watched. They believed that the one who entered the vaults no longer belonged to the world of men. The stairs spiraled downward, carved roughly into the rock. The air grew thick and cold, damp with the scent of stone and time. As the monk descended, the sound of the upper monastery faded away. Even the heartbeat seemed to quiet. At the end of the staircase lay a vast chamber, supported by heavy pillars of granite. Between them, shadows lingered like pools of ink. The vaults had no candles of their own. They were lit only by what little light the monk carried down. That small flame seemed fragile in the endless dark, yet it did not flicker. It burned with an unnatural steadiness, as if protected by the silence itself. The vaults were not empty. Along the walls stood hundreds of stone alcoves, each holding a single object: candles made of blackened wax, sealed jars filled with strange ash, fragments of broken wicks, and pieces of glass that shimmered faintly when touched by light. These were the remnants of candles that had burned too long, those that had melted beyond their purpose. The candle keepers believed that every candle had a life, and when it died, its wax remembered what it had seen. The lower vaults were a resting place for those memories. The monks called it the Chamber of Spent Light. When a monk entered, he did not move quickly. He walked among the alcoves, his candle held close to his chest, whispering no words. Sometimes he would stop and kneel before one of the objects, as if listening. It was said that faint echoes lived in the wax, moments of sound and breath trapped within. If one listened long enough, One could hear the voices of the dead keepers, murmuring like the faint crackle of cooling wax. In the center of the vaults was a circular well, covered by an iron grate. Beneath it, darkness extended downward endlessly. No one had ever seen its bottom. The monks called it the mouth of the flame. Every 100 years, when the great candle of renewal was lit above, the silent keeper would descend alone into the vaults, carrying with him the leftover wax from the last century. He would kneel before the grate and pour the wax slowly into the pit. The molten stream would vanish into the dark, making no sound as it fell. They believed that deep within the well, below all things, the first spark of the eternal flame still burned, the origin of all light. The act of pouring wax into that endless void was not meant to feed the fire, but to remind it that the world above still remembered. Around the well were markings on the floor, faint circles overlapping one another, forming patterns that resembled the ripples of water. In the flicker of the candlelight, they seemed to move. Some monks said that if one stared long enough, the circles would begin to spin slowly, as if time itself were turning beneath their feet. The vaults were not a place of fear, though few dared to speak of them. They were a place of stillness, where even the flame seemed to slow its breath. The walls glistened faintly in some places, coated with the residue of wax that had seeped down from centuries above. Every now and then, a drop of moisture would fall from the ceiling, and in that soft sound, echoing through the hollow space, the monk would feel as if the monastery itself were breathing. On the farthest side of the vaults stood an archway sealed with bricks. It was different from the rest, newer, smoother, and marked with the same symbol that appeared on the sealed door beneath the upper halls, the upside-down candle. No monk had ever passed beyond it. The silent keeper was said to kneel before it once each year, his candle extinguished, his forehead pressed against the stone. None knew what prayer he offered, or what waited behind that wall. Some said it was where the first candle-keeper had been buried. Others whispered that it was where the flame itself had once gone dark. A monk who descended each generation was never seen again. His candle, however, always returned, left burning at the foot of the stairs, its flame slow and steady. The next morning, another monk would find it there, still alive, still whispering its faint light against the stone. No one knew who had placed it there. In time, the vaults became more than a resting place for spent candles. They became a memory themselves, a silent echo beneath the monastery's life. Every flicker above, every breath of flame, every whispered prayer of silence was mirrored down below in the heavy, airless dark. It was said that if all the candles in the monastery were ever to go out at once, the lower vaults would awaken, that every piece of wax, every memory, every forgotten flame would rise together in one final breath of light. No one ever wished to see that day. And so, generation after generation, the monks above continued their endless rhythm, shaping wax, carrying flame, breathing silence, while beneath their feet the vaults waited, unmoving, dreaming of the light that had once been. There was a belief among the candle-keepers that every living thing breathed, not just men, not just beasts, but fire as well. The flame, they said, had its own breath, slow and delicate, invisible yet powerful enough to move the world. They called it the breath of flame. No one could see it, but they could feel it. When a candle was lit from the eternal fire, a faint warmth would rise in the air, spreading like a sigh. The monks said it was the moment when the flame inhaled the world, when it drew into itself the quiet, the patience, and the time of the monastery. The monks who tended the great hall of candles were trained to recognize this breath. They could tell when a candle was alive and when it was only pretending to burn. An alive candle, they said, had rhythm. It pulsed faintly, matching the heartbeats of those who stood near it. Each morning, before the sun reached the valley, the monks gathered to listen, not with their ears, but with their stillness. They would close their eyes and stand among hundreds of burning candles, waiting for the breath of flame to move through the air. When it did, They could feel it, a shift so soft that even the dust seemed to pause mid-air. The flames would tilt together, as if turning to listen. For centuries, this ritual continued unchanged. No one spoke, no one questioned. It was said that as long as the breath of flame could be felt each dawn, the monastery would remain remembered by time. But there were years, rare and quiet, when the breath did not come. Those were the years when even the wind refused to climb the valley. The candles burned straight, their light unblinking. The monks would stand for hours, waiting, but the stillness remained unbroken. When that happened, they would seal the doors of the hall for 3 days and 3 nights. No new candles were made, no wax was melted. The monastery entered silence, so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. During those nights, the silent keeper descended into the lower vaults, carrying no light. What he did there was never written, but by the 4th dawn, the breath would always return. The candles would sway again, the wax would weep, and the air would warm. It was said that the silent keeper carried a secret, that beneath the vaults, in a place deeper still, there was a hidden passage leading to the heart of the mountain. There, a chamber existed that no one had entered since the first day of the flame. It was called the lungs of the fire. Some believed that the flame itself was alive, that it slept and woke with the world. The lungs, they said, were where it drew its breath from the earth, the invisible rhythm that kept both monastery and mountain alive. No monk ever tried to find this chamber. It was enough to know that it existed. Faith, for them, was not built on discovery, but on repetition, on the slow act of doing the same thing perfectly every day for a lifetime. One parchment, kept hidden in the library of wax-lined shelves, spoke faintly of this mystery. The writing was nearly erased, but a few words remained visible under the candlelight, greater than, "When the flame forgets to breathe, the world will forget its name." No one knew who had written it. No one wanted to. Years turned into centuries. Seasons came and went, and the monks continued to tend their candles, their wax, and their silence. But the breath, that faint pulse of warmth that moved through the air each morning, began to change. It grew weaker. At first, the monks barely noticed. The flames burned the same, the hall still glowed, but the warmth that once touched their faces seemed thinner, colder. It was as if the flame had begun to exhale more than it inhaled. The silent keeper ordered more candles to be made, thousands of them, hoping their light would keep the monastery remembered. The monks obeyed. Day and night, the chamber of wax glowed with melted gold. Wax poured, cooled, and shaped. The halls filled with the scent of bees and smoke. Still, the breath did not return to its full strength. And then one morning, for the first time in living memory, a candle refused to light. The wick caught fire but died instantly, leaving behind a faint trail of smoke that curled upward and vanished. The monk who had lit it froze in silence. He tried again. The wax melted, but no flame held. Another monk tried, then another. The result was the same. The flame, it seemed, had rejected the candle. By dusk, the silent keeper appeared in the hall. His steps made no sound. He looked at the candle and placed his hand above it, palm facing downward. The air trembled faintly, though the candle remained dark. He whispered something that none could hear. The next moment, the wick caught fire, slowly, weakly, and the candle burned again. But the flame that rose was not golden. It was pale, almost silver. Its light moved strangely, like the breath of something tired. That night, the monks kept watch. They did not sleep. The silent keeper ordered no candles to be extinguished. Every flame was to remain alive until dawn. The halls glowed like a river of light, silent and eternal. But deep below, in the lower vaults, something shifted. A faint echo, like a sigh, moved through the stones, the kind of sound that did not belong to the living. The breath of flame had reached its deepest silence, And from that silence, something else began to wake. No one in the monastery spoke of it. They continued their rituals as they always had. The candles burned, the wax flowed, and the night stretched long. Yet in that calm light, every monk felt the same quiet truth pressing against their chest. The flame was still breathing, yes, but now it was breathing differently. He was called the Silent Keeper, but no one remembered his real name. Some said he had once been a novice like the rest, a young boy who had spoken too much and asked too many questions. Others whispered that he had been born within the monastery walls, from the same wax that shaped the first candles. No one could prove either story. The truth was simpler and heavier. The Silent Keeper was older than memory and younger than death. His face was hidden beneath layers of pale cloth. His hands, thin as candle stems, moved without sound. His eyes were rarely seen, for the hood he wore cast shadows even under flame. He never spoke, yet everyone heard him. When he walked through the halls, candles leaned toward him, not because of wind, but because of recognition. It was as if the flame itself bowed in his presence. The monks lowered their eyes when he passed, not out of fear, but reverence. To them, he was the living echo of the monastery, the bridge between what burned and what breathed. No one knew where he slept. Some said he never did. Others swore they had seen him standing at the edge of the valley at dawn, facing the mist, motionless for hours. He was there when the first candle was lit, and there when the last was extinguished at dusk. It was believed that his silence kept the breath alive. If he ever spoke, the monks said, the flame would shatter into ash. And yet, in the winter of the fading breath, when the pale fire began to appear, something about him changed. He moved slower, his presence heavier. His hands trembled faintly when lighting the morning candles. One night, after the bells had ceased and the valley had fallen into its deep dark, he descended alone into the lower vaults. The stairway spiraled endlessly, cut through the heart of the mountain. No monk had ever gone beyond the seventh step. But the Silent Keeper walked without hesitation, his feet brushing against centuries of wax that had dripped and hardened into strange shapes. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, not the cold of winter, but the cold of something untouched by light. The torches along the wall flickered as he passed. Some died, their smoke curling upward like fading breath. He carried no candle. He didn't need one. The air itself seemed to glow faintly around him, a silver aura, soft and quiet, the same hue as the flame that had refused to die. He reached the final gate, a vast bronze door engraved with 1,000 tiny marks, like fingerprints pressed into metal. No one alive knew who had built it. The monks called it the mouth of the mountain. The Silent Keeper stood before it and placed both palms upon the cold surface. For a moment, the vault was silent, utterly still. Then, slowly, the engravings began to move, not by magic, but by memory. The metal softened, pulsing faintly like living skin. A faint hum filled the space, rising from the stones below. He did not push the door. It opened on its own. Beyond it lay darkness, not absence of light, but a fullness of it, the kind of dark that felt alive, the kind that breathed. Inside, he stepped onto a floor made of black glass. Each step sent ripples of faint silver light beneath his feet. In the center of the chamber stood something ancient, a single candle, taller than a man, encased in crystal. Its wick was unlit, yet it radiated warmth. This was the first flame. According to legend, it had burned before the world began counting time. Every candle in the monastery, every spark, every glow, had come from this one breath. It had been sealed away, protected from the greed of light and the hunger of shadows. The Silent Keeper knelt before it. For a long moment, he did nothing. Only the faint rhythm of his breath echoed in the vast, hollow space. Then he raised his hands and pressed them together in front of his heart. the old gesture of awakening. When he opened them again, a tiny flicker of pale light appeared between his palms. It quivered, almost shy. Slowly, it drifted toward the crystal candle, touched the wick, and vanished. No fire caught. The silent keeper lowered his head. His voice, unused for decades, broke the air like the first crack of thunder after centuries of silence. Breathe. The sound was soft, but the walls trembled. The black glass rippled like water. Somewhere far above, in the upper halls, every candle flickered once, as if startled. Then, the first flame ignited. It did not burn red or gold or white. It burned silver, pure and cold, and its light did not reach far. It stayed close, curling around the silent keeper like smoke that remembered its shape. He exhaled once, long and slow, and whispered again. "Breathe." The flame responded, pulsing once more. It seemed to inhale the air around it, drawing in the dust, the silence, the age. The crystal that surrounded it began to melt, turning into glowing wax that pooled on the floor. But with every breath the flame took, the silent keeper grew paler. His body seemed to thin, as though the light was feeding on him. The silver glow grew brighter, and the air filled with the scent of burnt honey. By the time the first flame burned freely, the silent keeper was no longer kneeling. He was standing within the light, or perhaps he had become it. His robes, his hood, even his shadow had dissolved into the brilliance. The breath of flame filled the mountain once more, rising through the vaults and walls like invisible smoke. In the monastery above, candles flared awake, their light warmer, truer, alive again. The monks who stood watch felt tears slip down their cheeks. They didn't know why. They only knew that something sacred had ended, and something older had begun. When dawn touched the valley, the doors of the lower vault opened by themselves. From within came a faint, unending glow, not blinding, not bright, but the kind that never dies. No one ever saw the silent keeper again. But every morning after that, when the monks gathered to feel the breath of flame, they swore they could hear something in the air, a faint whisper, softer than smoke, that said only one word, "Breathe," and the candles obeyed. Morning in the monastery came without sunlight. It always had. The valley was too deep, the mountain too patient. Light arrived as a memory, not an event, a slow glow that slid along the stone and touched the candles before touching the eyes. After the night of the awakening, the monks found that their candles no longer burned as they used to. The flames swayed differently now, not restless, but aware. And within their soft crackling, something new began to speak. At first it was mistaken for wind or the faint hiss of melting wax. But those who listened carefully began to hear it, a rhythm between breaths, a pattern in the silence. It wasn't language as the living know it. It was older. It was slower. It was the sound of time remembering itself. The monks called it the whisper in wax. No one could write it down. No ink could follow it. No ear could hold it for long. It was a fleeting murmur that brushed against the soul and vanished before the mind could catch it. But those who heard it said it carried comfort, a quiet recognition, as though the monastery itself remembered their names. At dawn, when the first bells were struck, the sound mingled with that whisper, creating a low hum that filled the halls. The walls vibrated gently. The candles swayed as though breathing. And for the first time, the monastery felt alive in a way no one had known before. Some of the elder monks grew uneasy. They said the light was not meant to speak. That flame was sacred because it consumed in silence. Now it was speaking, softly, humbly, but still, it was speech. And that was change, and change was a kind of death. Others disagreed. They said the whisper was a blessing, a sign that the silent keeper had not vanished, but had become one with the light. His final breath had entered the wax, turning every candle into a vessel of memory. In the quiet rooms of the monastery, Monks began to listen more than they prayed. They sat beside their candles for hours, still as statues, waiting for the murmur to return. Some claimed to hear names. Others heard laughter, faint and distant. One monk swore he heard a lullaby he remembered from childhood, a song his mother used to hum by firelight. No one could explain how such things could live within wax. The abbot did not forbid the listening, but he warned gently. Light remembers only what it has seen, and not all memories are kind. Weeks passed in this new silence, a silence that was not empty, but filled with unseen motion, like the sea under ice. Every candle seemed to hold a story, but only a few dared to listen long enough to hear it. One afternoon, during the hour of stillness, a young novice dropped his candle. It fell to the floor and rolled beneath the altar. When he bent to retrieve it, he froze. From within the cooling wax, he heard a voice, clear this time, not a whisper. It said his name. He ran to the abbot, trembling, holding the small piece of broken wax in both hands. The abbot placed it on the stone table and watched as the wick flickered back to life on its own. No one touched it. The flame burned low, steady, and within it, faint shapes began to appear, shadows curling inside the light. They saw the silent keeper's outline for a moment, his hooded head bowed, his hands raised in that same old gesture of breath. Then, just as softly, the image melted into the flame. The monks fell to their knees, not in fear, but in surrender. They understood at last what the whisper had been trying to say. The keeper had not disappeared. He had simply become part of the remembering. The abbot recorded the event in the monastery's oldest journal, a book so ancient that its pages had turned soft like cloth. He wrote only one sentence that day, greater than the flame now breathes in voices. And from that day on, the candlelight carried not only warmth, but the sound of 1,000 forgotten breaths, the echo of monks long gone, of prayers long whispered, of days and nights that had folded quietly into wax. When the wind moved through the valley, the light shivered gently. Some said it was the keeper's sigh. Others said it was simply the air. But all agreed on one thing. The monastery was no longer just a house of candles. It had become a living memory, and within its walls, time itself had learned to whisper. There was a part of the monastery that few remembered, and fewer still had seen. It lay beyond the northern wall, a narrow passage sealed by wax and silence. For centuries it had remained closed, a forgotten rib in the great stone body of the monastery. But the whisper in wax had begun to move through the walls, and its echo found the cracks of old things. It was a cold morning when the monks first noticed it. The air in the hall of prayer had shifted, a faint draught that carried the smell of dust older than prayer itself. When they followed it, they found the hidden door. It wasn't a door in any ordinary sense. It was a smooth stretch of wall that bore faint impressions, like wax pressed by unseen hands. When they touched it, the surface trembled softly, as though remembering warmth. One monk pressed his palm flat against it and whispered the old word of light. Lux. The wall opened, not with force, nor with noise. It simply unfolded, a ripple of dust falling like slow rain. Beyond it lay a corridor stretching into shadow, lined with rows upon rows of candles. Hundreds of them. Thousands, perhaps. Each candle stood tall, its surface untouched, its wick perfectly preserved. None had ever been burned. Their wax was pale as bone, smooth as frozen breath. Cobwebs hung like veils between them, and the air smelled faintly of resin and old wax. The monks stood in silence, their own candles flickering faintly in the doorway. The abbot spoke softly. These are the unlit. It was a name that had appeared once before, centuries ago, in one of the monastery's oldest records, a brief mention in the margins of a weathered manuscript. Greater than, and beyond the northern wall rest the unlit, waiting for the light that was never born. No one had ever known what that meant. Until now. The monks entered slowly. Each step echoed softly, carried down the corridor like breath through a flute. The candles seemed to hum faintly, not with sound but with presence, as if aware of being seen again after an age of solitude. The abbot knelt by the first one and examined it closely. Its wax was cold, but beneath its surface ran faint lines, delicate and intricate, not cracks, but patterns. When he leaned closer, he realized they were tiny inscriptions, as though written by light itself. He fetched his reading glass and read the faint script aloud, greater than for the day that never came. He moved to the next candle, for the prayer that was never spoken, and the next, greater than, for the soul that never arrived. Each candle bore an inscription, each different, each sorrowful in its own quiet way. It became clear then what the unlit were. They were not candles for the living. They were candles for possibilities, for the moments that never happened, for the breaths that never became prayers, for the souls who had almost existed, but had slipped away before time could claim them. A monastery had kept them here, deep and hidden, a sanctuary for what never was. No one had spoken of it because no one had needed to. The act of preserving these candles had been the monastery's oldest vow, to remember not only what was, but also what was meant to be. As the monks walked deeper, the air grew thicker, heavier. The further they went, the colder it became, until their own candle flames began to thin and struggle against the weight of stillness. It was as though the corridor refused light, as though the unlit candles themselves drew the flame away. The abbot lifted his hand. "Extinguish them," he said softly. "Let the light rest." The monks blew out their candles, and the corridor accepted the darkness like a long-awaited breath. And yet, even in that blackness, the air seemed to glow faintly, not with visible light, but with awareness. A pale shimmer traced the edges of the walls, a light that didn't illuminate, but remembered. They stood there, feeling it. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of the weight of undone things. It pressed gently on their chests, like the memory of a promise one never fulfilled. After some time, the abbot turned back. "We will not light them," he said. "They belong to what might have been." But before they left, one of the younger monks lingered. He could not help himself. He reached out and touched the wick of one candle, a small, innocent gesture of curiosity. The wax beneath his finger pulsed once, faintly warm. Then he heard it, a whisper so soft it might have been his own breath returning to him. It said, "Thank you for remembering." He froze. The abbot, sensing something, turned and guided him away without a word. No one spoke as they left. The wall closed behind them, sealing the unlit once more into their corridor of quiet potential. For many nights after, the monks dreamed of unburned candles, rows of pale wax stretching into eternity, each one carrying a life that never came to be. And in their dreams, the unlit did not stand in darkness. They glowed faintly, as though their waiting was its own form of light. In the journals of the monastery, the abbot wrote, "Greater than light remembers what has burned. Wax remembers what has not. Between them stands time, holding both as truth." No one entered that corridor again. But sometimes, when the wind shifted through the northern wall, a faint smell of wax and honey drifted into the halls, as if the unlit were sighing gently, still waiting for the warmth they had been promised. And the monks, upon smelling it, would bow their heads, not in grief, not in fear, but in quiet reverence for the things that almost were. The monastery was built on a mountain of stone, but beneath that stone, time had been quietly gathering. For centuries, the monks had melted wax from candles offered, burned, or broken. When the wax could no longer hold a wick, it was taken below and poured into deep channels cut through the floor. No one questioned where it went. It simply disappeared into the dark beneath the monastery, into the ground that had long ago ceased to feel like earth. It was said that beneath the monastery lay rivers of wax, warm, slow, and luminous in their sleep. No monk had seen them, yet everyone believed they were there. They called it the underlight. But in the winter, following the discovery of the corridor of unlit candles, something changed. The monks began to notice a faint scent rising through the cracks in the stone, not of smoke or old wax, but something gentler, almost alive. A scent of damp earth mixed with sweetness. A scent no monastery candle had ever known. It came first to the lower halls, the air there always heavier, more secretive. Then to the sleeping chambers where monks awoke in the night, believing they had dreamt of fields. And one morning, when the abbot descended to the lower vaults to check the wax channels, he found a small crack running through the floor. Through it, a faint green glow was breathing upward. He knelt down, and for the first time in the history of the monastery, he smelled life in a place where only wax had ever existed. He summoned the elder monks, and together they widened the opening. Beneath it lay a hollow chamber, vast, glimmering, filled with slow drips of hardened wax that hung like stalactites. But among them, something extraordinary stirred. Small stems, delicate and pale, had grown through the layers of wax. Their leaves were translucent, their veins faintly glowing with the light of old candles. And at their tips bloomed tiny flowers, soft, golden, each one flickering faintly like a flame caught in slow motion. The monks stood in awe. None spoke, none moved. The abbot finally whispered, "Wax has remembered warmth." They named it the garden beneath the wax. It was unlike any garden the world had known. No sunlight ever touched it. No rain ever fell there. It lived entirely from the memory of heat, from centuries of prayers burned into molten wax, from the breath of candles long extinguished. The roots of those pale plants reached deep into the wax, drawing sustenance not from soil, but from memory. Each drop of wax that had once dripped from a candle carried within it a fragment of a prayer, a whisper, a hope, a confession. The garden fed on those forgotten fragments, turning remembrance into life. The monks explored carefully. Each step had to be slow. The floor beneath was not solid. It felt as though walking upon sleeping time. In one corner of the chamber, they found something remarkable, a wax pool that had not yet hardened. Its surface shimmered faintly, and beneath it they saw shapes, not reflections, but impressions. Hands, faces, small faint outlines of candles that had burned out centuries ago. The abbot touched the surface gently with the end of his staff. The liquid rippled outward, and for a moment, the glow from within grew brighter, revealing the roots of the plants spreading like veins through the wax. The abbot understood then that the garden was not a new creation. It was a continuation, the monastery's memory, transformed. He turned to the monks and said, "This is the afterlife of light." They spent the day observing. Every few hours, one of the small flowers would close, its faint glow dimming, while another would open, bright and slow. It was as though they took turns breathing, the entire garden pulsing in rhythm with the unseen heart of the monastery. In the following weeks, more discoveries came. When the monks stood silently among the flowers, they sometimes heard soft tones, notes too pure to be called sound, as though the garden was humming the melodies of ancient prayers. When they whispered old chants, the flowers seemed to tremble, their light fluttering gently in response. No one could explain it, but all agreed on one thing. The garden understood devotion. The abbot ordered that no flame was ever to be brought into the chamber. No fire must touch the memory of fire, he said. The monks obeyed. They crafted a narrow stairway leading downward, a spiral path carved through cooled wax and stone. Each step felt warmer than the one before. Those who descended said that the air down there held no sense of time. It felt like being inside a breath that had never been exhaled. With time, they began to record the garden's existence. The oldest scribe wrote, "Greater than below the house of silence lies the wax of centuries, and in that wax, light grows roots." "We have found the prayer that blooms." The monks took turns tending to the place, not with tools or hands, but with their presence. They would sit among the wax flowers and read aloud from the oldest texts. Some said the blossoms brightened during readings, as though understanding the rhythm of language. There were whispers that the garden itself listened, and that when monks passed away, their warmth, their essence, sank through the floors to join it. That their lives, too, became part of the wax. One night, during a deep winter storm, the garden glowed brighter than ever before. The monks above noticed the light seeping through the cracks in the floor, a golden pulse beating softly in the dark. When the storm passed, the glow dimmed again. The abbot wrote in his journal, "Greater than odd, the light below knows the wind above." It became their belief that the garden connected all levels of existence within the monastery: the wax, the flame, the air, the prayer. Everything that had ever been lit, whispered, or dreamed found its resting place there, beneath layers of time. The monks no longer feared the darkness of the lower vaults. They called it the warm dark, for even though no fire burned there, it carried the memory of every flame that ever had. When a monk passed away, his candle, the one that had burned beside his bed all his life, was melted carefully and poured into the channels. The wax would travel downward, joining the rivers that fed the garden. In time, a new flower would bloom, and the monks believed it carried the essence of that monk's prayers. The abbot once said, "Light does not end when it dies. It simply remembers itself differently." And so the monastery continued above, the candles burning and breathing in rhythm. Below, the wax dreaming and growing in silence. Together they formed a single body, a monastery built not of stone and faith alone, but of memory, warmth, and time turned gentle. When travelers occasionally passed near the mountain, they sometimes reported a strange glow beneath the earth, visible only on moonless nights. They thought it was a reflection of stars, but the monks knew better. It was the garden, breathing quietly beneath centuries of wax, alive with the memory of all that had ever burned. And in that silent glow, the monastery found its balance: light above, warmth below, and between them, the endless hum of remembering. In the quiet centuries that followed the founding of the old monastery, a slow transformation began to take shape. What had once been a small brotherhood of humble candle keepers gradually became the center of an entire system of discipline and order. History records little of the outside world during that period, but within the monastery's walls, every act, every silence, and every light had a purpose. It is said that around the year when the northern bells fell silent for a decade, the monks began to write down their customs in wax-bound tablets. These tablets, preserved through warmth and care, were not ordinary records. They contained rules written not in ink, but carved into softened wax, then sealed under layers of faint golden dust. The first of these was known as the Law of the Flame. The law stated that no candle shall burn without meaning. Every light, no matter how small, had to correspond to an intention, a prayer, a remembrance, or a record of time. A candle lit without purpose was seen as an error of discipline, a waste of both wax and will. The keepers who violated this law were not punished harshly, but their candles were quietly extinguished, and they were sent to meditate in the corridors of unlit stone. Over the decades, the monastery's daily rhythm became synchronized to the candles themselves. Morning bells were replaced by the first flame, a candle lit at dawn in the central chamber. When it was extinguished by the cold breath of noon, the second flame was lit to honor the labor of the day. By twilight, the third flame rose, a ritual of silence. And when darkness folded over the mountains, the fourth flame was kept beside the great window, not to light the room, but to signal the night's acceptance. Visitors who arrived in that age found the monastery strange and utterly still. They wrote in their diaries that time itself appeared to move according to light. Meals were taken when wax melted halfway down the taper. Sleep began only after the final wick dimmed to ash. There were no clocks, no sundials, and no spoken announcements. The monks followed a system of hours that only the candle's shadow could reveal. By the middle of that era, the candle keepers had unintentionally created a chronology of wax. Each new candle represented not a day, but a thought, a piece of time preserved through light. Scholars later discovered fragments of melted candle ends, carefully stored in jars, labeled with the date and purpose of their burning. One jar, for instance, read, "For the silence of the 112th winter." Another bore the inscription, "For the forgotten traveler who never returned." The monastery's library, by then, held not scrolls or books, but shelves upon shelves of these wax remains. Each piece was catalogued, its meaning recorded in small brass tags. This practice gave birth to a silent archive, where memory existed not as words, but as the quiet remains of melted time. As centuries turned, the outer world changed. Kingdoms rose and fell, roads shifted, rulers vanished, but the monastery remained fixed in its devotion to its own laws. Travelers began to call it the Monastery of Lighted Rules. Some even believed it to be a place outside ordinary time, where laws were not written by kings or scholars, but by candles. Yet, even among the monks, a quiet question lingered. Could time itself be bound by light? Could memory exist only while the flame burned? A few older monks began to keep unlit candles beside them as they worked, believing that unburned wax held potential, a silence yet to be shaped. Those who visited the monastery in its later centuries wrote of this strange philosophy. They described chambers lined with hundreds of unlit candles, all waiting for a reason to exist. Some visitors said that standing in that hall felt like being surrounded by unborn thoughts, as if every candle was a possibility that might never awaken. When the last chroniclers of that era left their records, they wrote in a tone both reverent and distant. "The keepers of the flame," one wrote, "live not by sight or season, but by the quiet law of wax." And so, as time continued to pass outside, within the monastery walls, history settled like dust. The candles burned, melted, and were reborn, their laws unchanged. The monks' silence remained the same, their devotion untouched. It was not faith in gods or kings that sustained them. It was faith in order, in rhythm, and in the gentle certainty that every flame meant something. In that stillness, the old monastery entered what later historians called the era of the burning law, and through its slow centuries, the candle keepers watched over their flames, each one a brief and flickering rule written in light. After the writing of the law of the flame, the old monastery entered what historians later named the Silent Decades. Little remains from this span of roughly 70 years, yet the few surviving fragments suggest an era of quiet precision. The candle keepers, now called flame masters in later texts, withdrew almost completely from the outside world. Their life was arranged around the rhythm of melting wax. The smallest details of existence were measured by it. Candles no longer served only ritual. They became instruments of record. Each monk was assigned a personal taper for the season, and its slow consumption was considered the measure of his obedience. If the wick burned evenly, his thoughts were said to be balanced. If it sputtered, the fault was believed to lie within the mind. The monastery's inner halls changed little in form, but greatly in purpose. The old corridors were sealed off, one after another, leaving only a single route through which novices could pass. This narrowing of movement was meant to mimic the narrowing of distraction. The monks learned to walk the same path each day until their steps aligned exactly with the pattern of dripping wax on the floor. Visitors who arrived in those decades described the air as cool and faintly perfumed with tallow. They wrote of walls darkened by smoke, yet polished by countless hands. There were no spoken greetings, no chants, only the sound of liquid wax sliding into bronze molds and the soft crackle of new wicks catching fire. Many who came seeking wisdom left believing they had entered a living clock made of light and silence. In the records of surrounding abbeys, there is mention of a condal council, a meeting that supposedly took place once every generation. The council decided how long the seasons would last, how many hours would belong to labor, and how many to reflection. The decision was expressed not through speech, but through the height of a ceremonial candle set in the center of the hall. A tall candle meant a long winter of study. A shorter one meant an early spring of work. Thus, even the calendar itself burned away slowly, leaving behind only waxen stubs as evidence of passing years. During these decades, the outside world began to forget the monastery. Trade routes shifted, kings changed, wars passed like storms beyond the mountains. But within the monastery, time folded inward. The keepers no longer recorded dates. They recorded the condition of the flame. Tablets from that period show entries such as, "The light trembled today, but did not fail," or "Wax fell before its hour." Cause unknown. To modern historians, these lines seem poetic, but within the monastery, they were simple reports, as ordinary as noting the weather. One rare account tells of the making of the great stand, an immense structure of stone and iron built to hold 400 candles at once. It stood in the central chamber and was said to represent the body of time itself. Each row marked a decade, and each candle within it a year. When one candle was finished, a novice would quietly replace it, never altering the pattern. At night the hall glowed like a field of slow-moving stars. The monks believed that as long as the great stand burned evenly, the world outside would remain in order. But no order lasts forever. Wax, after all, is temporary. By the end of the silent decades, the great stand had begun to tilt from the heat of its own devotion. The lowest tiers melted faster than those above. The symmetry the monks had guarded so carefully began to waver. A few fragments of later writing suggest that the keepers saw this not as failure, but as proof of the law itself, that every flame, no matter how controlled, must one day bow to time. As the last candles of that generation burned low, the keepers prepared a new rule, the law of balance. It stated that no flame should be allowed to live or die alone. When one candle was extinguished, another must be lit beside it, ensuring that darkness never arrived without witness. The law was simple, yet it changed everything. From that point forward, the monastery began to think not in single lights, but in pairs, the burning and the waiting, the seen and the unseen. This law ended the silent decades. It introduced movement once more, not speech, not sound, but a quiet exchange between lights. And thus the monastery stepped gently into a new age of reflection, still guided by the same wax, the same discipline, and the same patient passing of centuries. Historians refer to the period following the silent decades as the age of the twin flames. It began with the establishment of the law of balance, a decree that no candle would ever burn or fade in solitude. Every light must have its companion, a flame to mirror its existence, ensuring that the act of illumination was always shared. This law may appear symbolic to modern readers, yet within the monastery it was an exact discipline. Each monk was assigned a pair of candles, one for action, one for stillness. When a keeper began his work, he would light the first flame. When he ceased, he would light the second, not to see by, but to honor the rest that followed labor. In this way, light and pause became inseparable parts of the same devotion. Gradually, the physical design of the monastery changed to embody this principle. Every hall was fitted with paired niches, each holding 2 candles at equal height. The larger chambers contained hundreds of twin holders, arranged with mathematical precision so that no shadow fell unevenly. The reflection of flame upon flame created an atmosphere both luminous and subdued, a harmony of gentle repetitions. Records from that age describe the monastery as perpetually half-lit. There was no full brightness and no full darkness, only balance. Monks moved quietly through corridors where light trembled upon stone in perfect rhythm, as though the building itself were breathing. Travelers who entered these halls spoke of a sense of being watched by the light, as if each flame possessed awareness of its counterpart. The keepers took meticulous notes on the behavior of their paired candles. Wax flow, burn duration, smoke color. Every variation was documented. Over generations, they began to see these records not as science, but as a reflection of human conduct. A candle that burned too quickly beside a slow one represented impatience. A pair that extinguished at the same moment symbolized harmony. In this way, morality, philosophy, and ritual merged into a single system of wax and light. The law of balance also transformed the rhythm of the monastery's collective life. Meals were shared in pairs. Prayers were recited in alternating voices. Even sleep followed a pattern. Half the keepers rested while the other half watched the flames, so that the monastery was never entirely awake, yet never entirely asleep. To outsiders, this routine appeared mechanical. To those within, it was perfection, a living image of equilibrium. By the 3rd century of the twin flames, the monastery's archives had expanded into what some called the wax records of time. Each pair of candles that had served a keeper was stored in a sealed chamber, its stubs labeled and arranged in mirrored rows. The collection became so vast that visitors mistook it for a burial ground. Yet the monks saw it differently. To them, these remnants were not graves, but echoes, silent witnesses of order preserved. In one tablet from that era, a senior keeper wrote, "Greater than to burn alone is to err. To fade together is to understand." Such inscriptions reveal how the monks had come to view existence itself as a partnership between light and decline. They believed that creation and decay were equal acts in the service of balance. Even the act of replacing candles became ceremonial. When one candle finished its life, its companion was gently extinguished, and 2 new ones were lit together, one from the last spark of the dying flame. The transition was seamless, continuous, and wordless. During this period, the monastery achieved a reputation for serenity, unlike any other institution in the region. Pilgrims came from distant lands not to seek miracles, but to witness the art of stillness. Some stayed for a night and never left, drawn into the slow rhythm of shared illumination. Others described the place as a realm where nothing hastens and nothing lingers. Yet, as in all human systems, even balance carries the seed of imbalance. By the end of that age, small discrepancies began to appear. Wax supplies dwindled after a long winter. Some pairs of candles melted unevenly. The monks debated whether the meaning of balance lay in perfection or in acceptance of imperfection. A few argued that a tilted flame might hold deeper truth than a steady one. These discussions were never written as disputes, only as quiet observations in the wax tablets, greater than "the left flame bends to the wind, the right remains. Which one keeps the law?" Such reflections marked the closing years of the age of the twin flames. The monastery, though unchanged in appearance, was entering a subtler transformation, one not of form, but of thought. The keepers had learned to pair every flame, but now they began to question what lay between them, the unseen air, the space of silence that joined yet separated every light. That question, the nature of the space between, would define the next age of the candle keepers, an era that historians later called the study of shadows. When the age of the twin flames reached its quiet decline, the candle keepers turned their attention to what they had long ignored, the shadow. The study of shadows did not begin as a deliberate reform, but as a natural consequence of observation. Once every flame burned beside another, there remained between them a space untouched by light. It was thin, wavering, and faint, yet ever present. Over time, the monks began to regard this space as a subject worthy of understanding. Early records from this period refer to it as the interval. The monks wrote of the interval, as though it were a living presence. Light may reveal, one inscription says, but shadow remembers. They noticed that every surface within the monastery, the carved stones, the wooden benches, even the wax itself, held the memory of the flame's absence. Marks where candles had dripped left pale outlines, like silent borders between existence and retreat. The keepers began to document these borders. They measured the width of shadows cast by paired candles at different hours, recording the results on narrow sheets of wax mixed with soot. Their measurements were precise, sometimes noting differences so slight that only patience could reveal them. Through these slow observations, a new understanding emerged, that shadow was not the enemy of light, but its record. In the outer world, philosophy had long debated the nature of memory and substance. But within the monastery, the question became simpler. Could shadow hold truth? Could the absence of illumination teach as much as its presence? To explore this, the monks created chambers where candles were deliberately placed to cast long, deliberate lines of darkness across the floor. They named these lines paths of silence. Visitors who entered during those years described the halls as dim yet orderly, with narrow rivers of shadow flowing between the candles like ink on stone. The monks were seen kneeling at these dark bands, tracing them gently with the tips of their fingers. They were not praying, but studying, recording the slow drift of shadow as the flames bent and shrank through the hours. The act was meditative, almost motionless. It was said that some keepers could sit through an entire night watching a single strip of darkness lengthen, their minds emptied of all but the rhythm of change. From this practice arose the Codex Umbri, or Book of Shadows. Unlike previous records written on wax, this codex was etched into thin plates of metal coated with soot, so that the faintest mark of a finger left a trace of reflected light. The monks believed that true understanding of the flame required acknowledgement of its opposite, that no illumination was complete without the quiet memory of its loss. The codex contained thousands of entries, each consisting of a simple observation. Greater than, shadow extended beyond expectation. The darkness between flames was steady. Absence revealed the boundary of balance. To a modern reader, these seem abstract, yet within the monastery they formed an evolving philosophy, the belief that enlightenment was not a state of brightness, but a symmetry between presence and absence. As this discipline matured, the architecture of the monastery subtly changed. Windows were narrowed, corridors lengthened, and light was controlled with precision so that shadows could stretch naturally without disturbance. The walls grew darker over time, stained by smoke, yet the monks regarded this darkening as sacred, a visible sign of their devotion to observation. The outer world, once again, drifted further away. Centuries of silence passed, during which the monastery became known as the House of Living Shadows. Travelers who approached its gates found no guards, no movement, and no sound except for the quiet flicker of distant flames. Some wrote that stepping into its halls felt like entering a memory rather than a place. In this era, the candle keepers abandoned all concern with time. The rhythm of their days was measured not by melting wax, but by the slow migration of shadow across the stone. When a shadow reached the far wall, a candle would be moved. When it receded, another would be lit. Thus, darkness itself became the monastery's clock. The monks wrote fewer words, spoke less often, and lived as if they were shadows themselves, moving quietly, recording patiently, existing between the boundaries of light. They no longer sought perfection in flame, nor permanence in law. Their purpose had turned inward, toward the stillness that followed every act of illumination. The study of shadows would endure for centuries. Later generations of historians found almost no material evidence of it, only faint marks on the inner walls and fragments of soot-darkened metal. Yet even these remnants spoke of precision, patience, and reverence. One final inscription survives from that time, carved faintly into the stone of the central hall. Greater than light teaches us how to see. Shadow teaches us what remains. With those words, the candle keepers closed the age of illumination and entered a new silence, one where darkness itself became the bearer of truth. In the centuries following the study of shadows, the candle keepers passed into what historians later called the Age of Preservation. It was during this period that they became known, even among distant scholars, as the archivists of darkness. Their purpose was no longer the making of light, but the keeping of its memory. They believed that every shadow left behind by a candle contained a faint trace of the flame that had made it, a residue not of heat or light, but of meaning. To them, darkness was no longer absence. It was a form of archive, a delicate record that could be gathered, contained, and preserved. At first, their methods were simple. When a candle burned out, they would collect the soot from its wick and press it gently into thin sheets of wax. Each sheet was labeled with the date of the candle as extinction and the direction in which its shadow had last fallen. These small blackened tablets were stored in quiet rooms beneath the monastery, stacked in orderly rows that grew year by year. Over generations, the keepers refined their craft. They learned to capture darkness itself, not metaphorically, but through a ritual they called the sealing of silence. During the deepest hours of night, a monk would enter a chamber where no light was allowed to touch. Inside stood a single empty vessel, usually a jar of blackened glass or polished obsidian. The keeper would remain there for hours, allowing the silence and darkness to settle within the vessel. When he felt that the stillness was complete, he would seal the lid with wax and mark it with his personal sigil. To outsiders, such acts might appear symbolic, but within the monastery, the practice carried great precision. The jars were labeled, numbered, and arranged according to date and depth of stillness. Some were marked with phrases such as "night of steady air" or "shadow collected after the 9th bell." Each vessel represented not emptiness, but the preservation of an experience, the tangible record of a moment when the world had fully paused. By the height of this age, the monastery's lower vaults had become an immense archive. Shelves extended into darkness, filled with hundreds of thousands of sealed jars, each representing an instant of quiet existence. The monks began to believe that together these jars formed a kind of invisible library, one written not in letters, but in the language of stillness. It was said that senior archivists could read the darkness of a jar simply by holding it. They would close their eyes, sense the temperature of the glass, the density of air within, and claim to feel the tone of the night that had been preserved. Each vessel, one old record states, holds not what was seen, but what was not seen. The work was slow, repetitive, and without reward. No pilgrim came now to the monastery. No sound of bells echoed from its towers. The outer world had forgotten it entirely. Seasons passed unnoticed. The monks no longer kept track of years, but only of the deepening silence that marked their days. Within the monastery, language itself began to fade. The keepers spoke less, wrote rarely, and eventually replaced words with gestures. A raised hand meant light. A closed fist meant dark. The act of sealing a jar was accompanied by no prayer, no chant, only a breath released slowly into the stillness. Over time, the monastery's architecture adapted to this new devotion. The upper windows were sealed to prevent intrusion of light. Candles were lit only during the first moments of dusk, and then extinguished deliberately to create controlled shadow. The walls darkened with centuries of smoke, until the entire interior seemed to shimmer with a faint, silent blackness, not oppressive, but serene. Archaeological fragments found centuries later suggest that the keepers began to record their observations directly onto the surfaces of the jars themselves. Tiny inscriptions, etched with needles of bone, describe each preserved darkness in minimal language. Greater than still night, no sound, air unmoved, faint echo of wax cooling. This method of inscription, known now as the Index of the Night, became the monastery as final contribution to human record. When later historians discovered these relics, many could not read them. The language was reduced to signs so simple they seemed pre-linguistic, closer to breathing than writing. As the centuries drew to their end, the candle keepers ceased to burn candles entirely. Instead, they tended only to their archives, polishing the jars, sealing cracks, and ensuring the continuity of their silent collection. For them, preservation had replaced creation. They no longer sought to make light, only to remember that it once existed. It is said that the last generation of keepers spoke a vow before their order vanished, greater than to keep darkness unbroken, for in it sleeps all that once was light. And then, quietly, the record ends. After the centuries of darkness and preservation, the old monastery entered what later historians would call the era of the last light. By this time, the candle keepers had abandoned nearly all active illumination. The archives of darkness, the sealed jars, and soot-marked tablets had become the monastery's central purpose. Yet tradition demanded that a single flame remain, a symbolic bridge between the age of light and the age of shadow. This flame, preserved in the central chamber, was known as the sentinel candle. It was tended with meticulous care. Every keeper assigned to it was trained in the slowest possible methods of lighting and extinguishing, ensuring that the flame never surged or faltered. Its wax was carefully measured, drawn from a combination of old candles, melted and purified over decades. The wick was chosen for density and evenness, such that it could burn for years without interruption. Historical records indicate that the sentinel candle burned continuously, though no record survives of the exact number of years. Its light was intended not to illuminate the monastery, but to mark continuity, a reminder that though the ages of creation and study had ended, the essence of illumination still persisted in principle. Monks recorded the position, length, and color of the flame at regular intervals. Deviations were noted with precision. One tablet reads, "Greater than the flame leans toward the west." Air correction applied. Stability maintained. By the era of the last light, the monastery had become largely silent. Daily activities were reduced to essential maintenance, trimming the wick, replenishing the wax, cleaning the chamber, and inspecting the jars of preserved darkness. No ceremonies, no chanting, no movement beyond these minimal tasks. The world outside had long since ceased contact, and maps no longer included the monastery. Some observers, centuries later, speculated that the keepers themselves may have disappeared entirely, leaving only instructions and the sentinel candle. Others argued that even if monks remained, their presence was immaterial to the historical record. The candle, the wax, and the shadow were sufficient. The architecture of the monastery by this time reflected its purpose: narrow corridors, sealed windows, and thick stone walls to maintain stable air conditions. The central chamber was lined with mirrors, allowing the single flame to reflect infinitely, symbolically multiplying itself while remaining alone. These reflections were studied as indicators of light decay and balance, their patterns recorded in soot-marked tablets. During this era, the candle keepers formalized a final doctrine, the principle of witness. It stated that the flame itself, once lit, bore witness to the existence of all others, past candles, paired lights, and even shadows. Through this principle, the monastery claimed that even a single flame could sustain centuries of ritual memory. No matter how few keepers remained, the sentinel candle ensured that the monastery's history endured. By the late years of this period, the sentinel candle was described as unusually small, yet remarkably stable. Historical fragments note, "Greater than the wick has shortened. Flame diminishes slightly. Observation continues uninterrupted. The chamber around the flame was empty, except for the jars of preserved darkness." Their arrangement formed concentric rings around the candle, a silent map of centuries of careful observation. The interplay between the remaining light and the stored shadows created a subtle rhythm, perceptible only to those who remained in the room for hours, days, or longer. Historians suggest that this period exemplified the final philosophy of the candle keepers, that memory, balance, and observation were of greater importance than creation or spectacle. Light was no longer an end in itself, but a method of maintaining continuity, a witness to its own absence and to the silence that had succeeded it. Eventually, records cease. The last entries concerning the sentinel candle describe only its position, the condition of the wick, and the integrity of the jars surrounding it. No further notation survives regarding its extinguishing, nor the end of the monastery itself. The final tablet reads simply, "Greater than light remains." Observation continues. Through this last act, the monastery completed its transition from an active institution of illumination to a living archive, a repository of light, shadow, and time. The era of the last light, though nearly invisible to the outside world, preserved centuries of ritual, measurement, and contemplation. Its history, encoded in wax, soot, and glass, would become a silent testament to the dedication of those who had sought not glory, but the careful recording of existence itself. Following the era of the last light, the old monastery entered what scholars refer to as the age of complete silence. The sentinel candle, once a solitary beacon, had become less an object of illumination and more a symbol of continuity. The daily rhythm of life, once measured by wicks, shadows, and paired flames, now slowed to a near imperceptible pulse. The candle keepers, whether in physical presence or through the instructions left for successors, focused entirely on the care and preservation of the monastery's archives, the silent vaults. These vaults, located in the deepest sections of the monastery, were constructed to house not only the jars of preserved darkness, soot tablets, and wax remnants, but also any record of light itself. Chambers were reinforced with thick stone to stabilize air and temperature. Access was limited to a small number of keepers at a time, ensuring that neither breath, heat, nor incidental light disturbed the delicate balance. The vaults were organized according to centuries-old principles. One chamber contained only the earliest jars of darkness, collected during the study of shadows. Another contained remnants of paired candles from the age of twin flames. Yet another held fragments of the sentinel candle, preserved after each careful trimming over decades. Each vessel and tablet was catalogued meticulously, a silent testament to time passing without interruption. Within these chambers, light was rare and measured. Any illumination came only from brief, controlled exposures, typically no longer than the time required to inspect a single jar. Reflections were minimized, shadows maximized. The keepers developed instruments to observe without intrusion, mirrors to direct the faintest rays, lenses to focus tiny patches of light on inscriptions, and opaque containers to prevent unwanted exposure. Records from the silent vaults period indicate an obsessive attention to preservation. Tablets note the alignment of jars with respect to the remaining architecture, greater than row 12, column 7, jar oriented toward north, shadow check complete, airflow stable, wax remnants 0.2 grams, lighter than previous measurement, adjustment unnecessary, documented. Over time, this meticulous cataloging evolved into a form of ritual. Daily maintenance of the vaults involved sequences repeated exactly, without variation. Jars were polished, labels checked, and dust carefully removed. Even the minor vibration of footsteps was monitored. The monks believed that any disturbance might compromise centuries of careful preservation. Interestingly, historical fragments suggest that the candle keepers did not consider the silent vaults merely storage. They viewed them as a continuation of the monastery itself, a living entity composed of light, shadow, and memory. Each jar of darkness was regarded as a participant, each wax remnant as a witness. The act of preservation was simultaneously an act of devotion, not to any deity, but to order, rhythm, and the passage of time itself. Visitors, if any survived the centuries, described these chambers in uniform terms: a sense of weight, a muted presence of centuries compressed into stillness. Even when viewed from the periphery, the arrangement of jars and tablets conveyed both history and philosophy, light and shadow, action and absence, all catalogued and conserved. The space itself seemed to breathe slowly, as though the collected memory of countless flames filled it with life unseen. The silent vaults were also sites of experimental preservation. Monks tested methods to enhance longevity, layering wax between jars, sealing airtight vessels, and applying thin coatings of soot or resin to prevent decay. Some fragments reveal attempts to preserve even the subtlest imprint of a candle's glow, the faintest reflection, the trace of heat, or the microscopic shift in shadow. These experiments, though technical, were carried out with ritualistic precision, the act of preservation itself considered sacred. As centuries continued, the monastery grew more removed from the physical world. No roads led to its gates. No communication passed beyond its walls. The keepers themselves became fewer, their numbers reduced to a handful of individuals who could sustain the delicate processes of observation, cataloging, and maintenance. And yet, the silent vaults remained complete. Not a single jar was missing, not a single tablet misplaced. The monastery, though nearly devoid of life, had achieved an almost mathematical order. Historical annotations from this age suggest a philosophical evolution. The candle keepers began to record not only the material state of their archives, but also reflections on the passage of light and darkness. Greater than the smallest jar holds the memory of a century. The faintest shadow bears witness to more than observation. Silence itself must be preserved. It is the final custodian of all flames. Through this meticulous dedication, the silent vaults transformed into both library and sanctuary. Light became unnecessary for existence. Shadow, absence, and preserved memory sufficed. Every object, every surface, every subtle gradient of darkness carried information, contributing to an ordered system that spanned centuries. Thus, the old monastery entered a stage beyond illumination and ritual. It existed entirely as a repository, a living archive of light, shadow, wax, and memory. The silent vaults ensured that even if all candles were extinguished and all keepers gone the structure of observation and preservation would endure a timeless monument to the quiet discipline of those who had once devoted their lives to the careful measurement of existence itself. As the centuries progressed, the old monastery of the candle keepers remained isolated, yet subtle effects of its presence began to ripple beyond its walls. Though no pilgrim entered and no correspondence left its gates, the meticulous preservation of light, shadow, and wax left traces, echoes, historians later called them, in the surrounding environment and cultural memory. By the later part of the Silent Vaults era, scholars observed that the precise alignment of candles and jars within the monastery had created measurable patterns in ambient air and temperature. The thick stone walls and sealed chambers, designed to stabilize shadows, also influenced the surrounding microclimate. Slight shifts in wind, moisture, and temperature around the monastery were recorded in nearby valleys. Farmers noted unusually even frost patterns. Streams flowed with subtle consistency, and seasonal changes were described as less abrupt than in distant regions. Though unknown to them, these effects were faint echoes of the meticulous environmental order maintained inside the monastery. Historians suggest that this influence was entirely unintentional. The candle keepers were focused exclusively on internal observation, preserving darkness, cataloging wax, and monitoring the sentinel candle. Yet their devotion to absolute order created external resonance, subtle enough to go unnoticed, yet persistent across decades. In essence, the monastery acted as an anchor, holding time and rhythm in quiet stability. At the same time, fragments of manuscripts indicate that local myths began to form. Travelers and wandering scholars, though few, spoke of a distant place where nights were unusually calm, where shadows seemed deeper, and where even the light of the moon appeared to hesitate before reaching the ground. These accounts, transmitted orally over generations, described an invisible presence, a repository of light and darkness, influencing the world without direct contact. To modern researchers, such accounts are often categorized as folklore. To the candle keepers, they were irrelevant, as their focus never extended beyond the care of their silent vaults. Inside the monastery, the practice of preservation continued without deviation. New jars of darkness were collected as old candles were extinguished. Wax remnants and soot tablets accumulated in carefully measured rows. Observations became increasingly abstract, noting not only physical properties, but the subtle interplay of absence, reflection, and perception. Greater than the shadow in the western chamber grows denser after wind from the north. Reflected light upon polished jars shifts by 0.1 degree each night. Maintain observation. This period of subtle influence also saw the refinement of the monastery's internal philosophy. While light had once represented existence and shadow the record of absence, the keepers now emphasized relation, the interaction between objects, shadows, and the perception of both. Even a single jar of preserved darkness was considered an active participant, influencing adjacent jars and the distribution of shadows throughout the chamber. In this way, the monastery was a dynamic system, despite the absence of motion, speech, or external input. Technological adaptations, though minimal, were implemented with care. Monks constructed tiny reflective surfaces to direct the faintest glimmers of the sentinel candle onto specific jars, ensuring that observation remained precise. They also devised methods to stabilize air movement, allowing shadows to extend in predictable patterns. These adjustments, though minute, demonstrate the keeper's commitment to perfection, even in a period of isolation. Over time, these echoes began to affect human perception in indirect ways. Travelers passing near the monastery later described inexplicable calmness, an unusual clarity of thought, or a fleeting sense of order in otherwise chaotic surroundings. Some attributed this to meditation, prayer, or natural phenomena. Modern researchers hypothesize that the physical stability and subtle environmental effects generated by centuries of controlled flame and shadow contributed to these impressions. The monastery's influence was therefore persistent, though invisible, echoing outward without the keeper's awareness. At the same time, internal evolution continued. Monks refined the process of cataloging each shadow, developing subcategories that accounted for weight, density, diffusion, and duration. Shadows were no longer merely noted as present or absent. They were measured, compared, and recorded in hierarchical order. In the final decades of this era, the monastery's record-keeping was arguably more comprehensive than any human-written chronicle outside its walls. Yet it remained invisible, silent, and self-contained. By the end of this period, historians suggest the monastery had achieved a unique equilibrium. Light, shadow, wax, and air interacted in a continuous cycle, internally monitored and externally imperceptible. The candle keepers, now almost mythic figures, maintained order without intervention, observation without contact, and continuity without awareness of the outside world. The echoes of their meticulous preservation, however, persisted beyond walls, shaping subtle currents of time and perception in ways no chronicler could document fully. Thus, the monastery's legacy endured, not through written records or active engagement, but through the silent, precise, and patient management of light, shadow, and memory. Its influence was subtle, pervasive, and timeless, a testament to centuries of unwavering dedication to order and observation. Following the subtle echoes that radiated from the old monastery, the candle keepers entered what historians later classified as the era of the eternal catalog. By this time, physical candles were nearly obsolete. Wax and light existed only as residual concepts, while the act of observation itself became the central practice. The monastery no longer functioned as a space for illumination, but as a living archive, a system of order maintained through the meticulous recording of presence and absence. The eternal catalogue was both method and philosophy. Every jar of preserved darkness, every soot tablet, every fragment of melted wax was catalogued in a hierarchy of precision. Each entry contained exact measurements: weight, density, length of burn, gradient of shadow, and subtle shifts in air currents. Annotations described changes over decades, the gradual compression or expansion of darkness, and the slow erosion of materials. This detailed system created a vast temporal map of the monastery, spanning centuries without a single deviation from method. The keepers formalized a method of indexing that would influence later archival practices, though no contemporary observer was aware. The system emphasized relational positioning rather than chronological sequence. Shadows were cross-referenced against candle remnants. Jars of soot were compared to wax tablets, and minute temperature fluctuations were charted against the tilt of the sentinel candle. In this way, the eternal catalogue became a living, interconnected structure, a lattice of observation that allowed the monastery to remember without relying on human presence. Architecturally, the monastery adapted to serve the catalogue. Vaults expanded downward and inward, forming nested chambers designed to minimize environmental disturbance. Shelves of jars were arranged in mirrored symmetry. Narrow corridors allowed movement without altering air or light patterns. Windows were sealed, vents regulated, and floors reinforced to prevent vibration. Even the stone itself was polished to reflect subtle gradations of shadow, enabling minute observation with minimal intervention. Observations within the catalogue grew increasingly abstract. Where earlier monks recorded light, shadow, and wax, the keepers of this era began to note relational phenomena. Greater than shadow X by 0.3 degrees from jar 12. Wax residue aligns with mirror reflection. Air displacement steady for 72 years. In many cases, these notations resemble a language of pure measurement, devoid of metaphor or narrative. They reveal a philosophical evolution, that reality could be recorded not as a story or image, but as a network of relations, patterns, and continuities. The monks had, in essence, transformed the monastery into a theoretical construct, a living, precise catalogue of existence itself. The sentinel candle, once a central feature of illumination, remained but as a reference point. It was rarely lit, only briefly, to recalibrate observations or to record new changes in the environment. In its absence, darkness was the constant, and jars, wax, and soot became proxies for centuries of light. The catalogue accounted for every deviation. A shadow that lengthened unusually, a jar that lost minute particles of soot, or a tablet whose edges warped subtly over time. Every imperfection was recorded, yet no correction was attempted. The record itself was considered sufficient. Historians studying fragments of the eternal catalogue note its paradoxical nature. Though designed for preservation, it was never complete in the human sense. There were no narratives, no dates of kings or events, no recognition of external happenings. Instead, the catalogue contained an exhaustive record of the monastery's internal reality, a meticulous mapping of space, light, darkness, and decay over centuries. It was an archive of time experienced, not witnessed, and of change measured, not interpreted. During this era, interaction with the outside world was non-existent. The monastery became effectively autonomous. Environmental factors such as temperature, air pressure, and humidity were monitored and indirectly managed through the structure itself. The walls, floors, and vaulted ceilings functioned as both archive and instrument. In essence, a monastery became a self-regulating system. Observation maintained order, and order preserved observation. The philosophy underpinning the eternal catalogue is summarized in the final surviving inscriptions from this era. Greater than, to observe without interference is to preserve. To record without embellishment is to endure. The pattern itself holds continuity. These principles illustrate the culmination of centuries of evolution in the monastery. From the early age of twin flames, through the study of shadows, the archivists of darkness, and the era of the last light, the candle keepers had moved from active creation to preservation, and finally to theoretical perfection. Light, wax, and shadow had become symbolic, while observation and relational record-keeping became absolute. The eternal catalog represents not a story, but a structure, a carefully measured, endlessly persistent system that allowed the monastery to survive conceptually long after physical presence may have vanished. It is in this era that the candle keeper's philosophy reaches its final expression, a devotion not to illumination itself, nor even to memory, but to the precise mapping of existence and absence. The meticulousness of the catalog ensured that, even in total isolation, the monastery retained coherence. Every jar, tablet, and shard of wax contributed to a system in which order persisted independently of any observer. In this sense, the old monastery became timeless, a sanctuary not of light, but of recorded principle, echoing through centuries in measured silence. In the centuries following the era of the eternal catalog, the old monastery of the candle keepers entered what later historians referred to as the age of the vanishing flame. By this point, physical light had become nearly obsolete. The sentinel candle, once the emblem of continuity, now burned only intermittently, its flame measured in minutes rather than hours. The monastery existed increasingly as a structure of recorded observation, of wax, soot, and shadow, rather than as a place of illumination. Records from this age indicate that the keepers no longer prioritized illumination. Candles were lit solely to recalibrate observations, to test shadow patterns, or to mark the presence of time in the eternal catalog. Even then, the flame was minimal, maintained for its symbolic function rather than its practical utility. Historical notes meticulously record its size, tilt, and rate of burn. Greater than sentinel candle lit at first hour. Flame observed, 1.2 centimeters. Tilt westward 0.2 degrees. Air steady. Extinguished at second hour. Observation logged. The vanishing flame era marks the final convergence of light, shadow, and memory. The monastery's architecture, already adapted to support the eternal catalog, remained static, ensuring perfect preservation of all objects. Vaults continued to house jars of darkness, wax remnants, and soot tablets. Mirrors, polished stone, and reflective surfaces were aligned with increasing precision, allowing minuscule traces of light to register within the system without active illumination. During this time, the candle keeper's focus shifted entirely to longevity and continuity. Every object within the monastery was examined for durability. Wax tablets were reinforced with layered coatings. Jars were sealed and repositioned to minimize stress from temperature fluctuations. Inspections occurred with exacting regularity, yet no physical work disturbed the recorded system beyond what was necessary to maintain its integrity. The philosophy of the vanishing flame reflects the culmination of the monastery's centuries-long evolution. Light had become a reference, shadow the record, and observation the sustaining principle. Historical annotations from this period emphasize restraint and precision. Greater than to interfere is to lose. To preserve is to witness. The candle is no longer the center. It is the measure. Interestingly, this era produced the most detailed and methodical documentation of any prior period. The keepers noted the slightest changes in shadow angles, wax density, and jar integrity. Observations were often repeated over decades to ensure consistency. Every fragment, every residue, every trace of light or darkness was cross-referenced in the eternal catalog. In this way, the monastery became a self-referential archive, a system that could, in theory, persist without any human presence. By the later centuries of this age, the sentinel candle had become almost entirely symbolic. It was lit perhaps once per decade, briefly and carefully recorded before being extinguished again. A monastery's existence relied not on flame, but on the accumulated structure of shadow, wax, and relational observation. The walls, floors, and sealed chambers effectively maintained the equilibrium established over centuries. Historians suggest that this period represents the final stage of the candle keeper's philosophy. The monastery was no longer a space of light, nor even a repository of physical darkness, but a conceptual system in which time, memory, and observation were codified into an enduring pattern. Light existed only as a reference point, shadows as evidence, and the eternal catalog as the sustaining framework. Notably, the vanishing flame era reflects a philosophical acceptance of impermanence. The keepers recognized that physical light would inevitably disappear. Their role was not to prevent this disappearance, but to ensure that its trace, measured, recorded, and structured, would persist indefinitely. In essence, the monastery became an abstract entity, a map of centuries, a lattice of observation, and a monument to careful continuity. The final surviving entries of this age are succinct, greater than flame extinguished, observation maintained, integrity preserved, shadow remains, wax stable, eternal catalog updated. Through these brief notations, historians deduce that the monastery had reached the ultimate expression of its centuries-long mission, the transition from active illumination to total preservation. The vanishing flame signified the end of tangible light, but not the end of the monastery's purpose. Its legacy was preserved entirely within structure, record, and principle, a silent testament to the meticulous discipline of the candle keepers. Thus the old monastery completed its long evolution. From the first paired flames to the sentinel candle, from the study of shadows to the eternal catalog, and finally to the vanishing flame, it had passed through stages of creation, observation, preservation, and abstraction. Light had disappeared, yet the monastery endured, a repository of centuries of careful measurement, a chronicle of shadows, and a system designed to outlast the human presence entirely. With the vanishing flame extinguished, the old monastery entered what historians now call the era of silence complete. By this time, no candle burned, no wax melted, and no human presence remained within its walls. The sentinel candle, once the emblem of continuity, had disappeared entirely. Yet the monastery endured, not as a building, but as a living archive, a repository of centuries of light, shadow, and observation. The legacy of silence is defined by the monastery's persistence without intervention. Its architecture, carefully designed over centuries, maintained the internal equilibrium of shadows, air, and residual material. Vaults continued to house jars of preserved darkness, soot-coated tablets, and fragments of wax, all positioned with exacting precision. Mirrors, polished surfaces, and reflective stones sustained subtle environmental patterns, allowing the system to maintain its internal balance even in total absence of human caretakers. Historical analysis suggests that the monastery functioned as an autonomous record. Physical decay occurred at an imperceptible rate, mitigated by the sealed design and careful placement of materials. The eternal catalog, the culmination of centuries of observation, remained intact. It contained relational data, alignment of shadows, density of wax, dimensions of jars, and minor changes in air and temperature. Through this system, the monastery continued to observe itself, preserving its own internal reality across centuries. Scholars note that the legacy of silence represents the ultimate evolution of the candle keeper's philosophy. Light, once central, was no longer required. Shadow, once recorded as absence, now existed as the primary record. Observation, formerly performed by monks, was encoded into the arrangement of materials and architecture itself. In this way, the monastery achieved self-sufficiency, transcending human presence while maintaining the principles established over generations. The broader influence of the monastery persisted indirectly. Though no visitor entered and no communication passed outward, environmental echoes continued. Slight effects on airflow, temperature, and local microclimates were measurable for centuries. Remote observers noted unusual stability in surrounding valleys, consistent patterns of frost, and subtle shifts in river currents. These phenomena, though never attributed to human action, reflected the meticulous design and centuries of order maintained within the monastery. The philosophy underpinning the legacy of silence can be summarized in surviving inscriptions. Greater than to observe is to preserve. To measure is to endure. Even absence holds record. These brief statements, etched in stone and soot, encapsulate the candlekeeper's ultimate achievement. They had transformed the monastery from a place of active ritual into a timeless system of record, memory, and balance. Light, shadow, wax, and air became a lattice of persistence, a structure that could survive indefinitely without human presence. The old monastery, in its final centuries, exists in history both materially and conceptually. Physically, it is a collection of stone, glass, wax, and soot. Conceptually, it represents a culmination of centuries-long dedication, from the paired flames of the early age of twin candles, to the study of shadows, the archivists of darkness, the sentinel candle, the silent vaults, the eternal catalogue, and finally, the vanishing flame. Each stage contributed to a continuous evolution of observation and preservation, culminating in the monastery's ability to maintain order without intervention. In this sense, the legacy of silence is both historical and philosophical. It demonstrates that rigorous attention, patience, and careful methodology can transcend individual lifespans. The monastery's enduring presence is a record not of events or narrative, but of principles, a testament to the meticulous discipline of those who devoted their lives to the interplay of light, shadow, and memory. Though the candle keepers themselves vanished and the final flame disappeared, the old monastery remains, silent, ordered, and eternal. Its jars of darkness, soot tablets, and fragments of wax continue to embody centuries of observation. The legacy of silence ensures that the structure, philosophy, and meticulous record of light and shadow endure, a monument to human dedication transformed into timeless principle. Through these centuries of study, preservation, and abstract cataloging, the old monastery stands as both archive and lesson, that even in absence, through order and precision, history can persist. That light and shadow, presence and absence, can together create a system capable of enduring far beyond the lives of those who began it.